Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about today, we're going to continue with walls. Okay, we're going to continue with walls. We'll talk about different techniques, kind of proper drawing techniques. Okay, so that when drawing walls, that you can get nice, accurate dimensions. But mostly, we're going to talk about the different modification tools. All right, so I'm going to just jump into my level 1 floor plan. So right now, you should have a little bit something that kind of looks like this. Hopefully, your project looks like this. All right. But I'm going to open up the wall command, and I'm just going to pick a basic wall for showing you some of these different techniques, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and choose the 6-inch wall assembly, and let's look at our different modification tools. So I'm going to go up to, let's see, where's my, okay, modify, architecture, wall. And our first wall assembly is going to be generic 6-inch, okay? So I'm going to draw a couple different walls. Draw one here, and I'm going to draw one here. And the first modification tool we're going to look at is, why are they not coming up? Okay, right here. So when I say modification tools, what I'm referring to is all of the tools under modify walls and then under the modify subsection, okay? These tools will pop up once you start drawing your walls, okay? So the first one we're gonna look at is the trim extend to corner tool, okay? For those of you that use CAD, it's kind of similar to like fillet, okay? So whereas you select a couple walls and they're going to join together in a perfect corner, okay? So if I select my 2 walls, okay, I'm going to go ahead and click on the trim extend to corner command, and then from there I will click on my 2 walls, and notice that when you hover your mouse over the second wall before you click on it, it shows you the path of where they'll come together. Okay, so that's going to be the trim extend corner command, and it doesn't matter, they don't have to be in a 90-degree fashion. It could be something like this, maybe it's something like this. Okay, you can simply click on the 2 different walls that you want to extend and trim the corner, and it will bring them together in a perfect fashion. Okay, see how that works? So that's going to be our trim extend corner command. So a lot of times you would use that in an instance where I know I saw a lot of people when drawing the first couple walls up here. They would try to draw it perfectly up to the corner, and then they would take the next one and try to draw it perfectly right up to its corner. Well, in reality, and if you try to keep it simple, you could just kind of start drawing it just a little bit, draw the next wall, and you can always just trim them together, okay? So you'll know they always come together in the correct fashion too. All right? So that's going to be the trim extend corner command. Now, let's see. Let's look at another one. So let's move up to the top. We have another one that you might use is rotate. So if you click on that wall, it works exactly how you probably imagine that it works, okay? So you'll notice here that you get this little line that rotates around the center of the wall. The wall will always rotate by default at the center of the wall. If you want to rotate it from a different location point, you can actually go up here to your ribbon, and you can click on under center of rotation, you click on place. I can actually define that location of where you want to rotate. So maybe you want to rotate it at the end. I can now change the wall so that I can rotate it from the end. So let me just delete the first wall, because the reason why it didn't work was because it was actually already attached to another wall. So I'm going to click on that, click on rotate. You can specify the number of degrees that you want to rotate, so you don't have to go, all right, I want to move it 30 degrees. I don't need to, bring it to exactly 30. You can simply just type in 30. Just like when you're drawing distances, you don't need to type in degrees or anything like that. You can just type in 30, and it will rotate that wall 30 degrees. Notice that when I did that, I also got an area here where I can actually edit that angle. Okay, so maybe you want to change it to 40. You can easily do that. All right. So again, that's the rotation tool. All right. And I can also change my center of rotation. So what I tried to do first was I maybe want to select the end point, and I want to move this up 30 degrees. It will now change that center of rotation to the location that I want it to be at. All right. Next tool. Let's look at copy. All right. Copy is a tool that we'll use all the time, okay? You'll use it very frequently. So if I click on my wall, let's say I want to copy this wall, I'm just going to think of a situation. Maybe you're creating some apartments, and maybe those apartments are spaced every 40 feet on center. Okay, so I'm going to go to copy, and I can simply define the location of where I want to start the copy. So whether it be the center of the wall, maybe it be the edge of the wall, ultimately up to you. So I'm going to show you basically how the commands work, but in reality, how you use them is up to you. And becoming really efficient at Revit is learning how to, is learning when to use them at the right time. Okay, I can't think of every scenario of when you would use them, but as you work over the next couple weeks, think about always kind of pushing yourself to use those modify commands, because those modify commands will ultimately help you work efficiently and quickly. Okay, when I see people trying to drag the walls and try to connect them all together, there's usually a tool that will help you do that more efficiently. Okay, and I'll try to help you do that as I walk around and talk to you guys over the next couple weeks. Okay, so copy. So let's say I want to copy this over 30 feet. So I'm going to go ahead and click one time. I can now move that wall in the direction that I want to, whether it be this direction, up, down, okay? And just like all of the tools, I can simply just punch in the distance that I want to copy it, okay? So 30 feet. So I clicked on the copy command. I'm going to go ahead and copy these from the center line of that wall, and I can just simply type in 30, enter. And now I've copied that wall 30 feet on center, okay? So same thing with like laying out studs, just depending on how you work and how you think would potentially change that, okay? So that's the copy command. Let's look at it in a little bit more detail. Let's say you want to copy multiple items, okay? I'm gonna click on copy, and I'm gonna check the box that says multiple, okay? So what this does, if I uncheck multiple, notice that when I bring it down and I click one time, the command has ended, okay? I'm no longer using the copy command. But if I click on that wall, click on copy, and I check multiple, that will allow me to copy multiple instances of that wall. So maybe I go 6 feet, 6 feet, 6 feet, 6 feet, 6 feet. So basically you did like an array of that wall, but I can do it multiple times without the command stopping, okay? So that's the multiple feature of copy. One more is I'm going to go to copy. Notice that you have a button here called constrain, okay? A lot of you guys might be familiar with in AutoCAD, you type in ortho, and that keeps you from keeping all of your lines orthogonal to each other. Well, if I don't check it, notice that I can copy that wall in any direction that I want. Well, if you know you're working on something that you want to keep everything nice and orthogonal, you're going to simply check the box that says constrain, okay? Now notice that I can only move my wall in 90-degree increments, okay? So I'm sure you'll run into situations where you need to use that as well, okay? I think someone asked a question earlier on how to be able to do that. Well, when you click on either move or copy, you can click on that constrain button for either of those two options. Okay, any questions about either of those two tools? Good, all right, keep on moving forward. The next tool is gonna be the move command, all right? So I click on move. Move works very much just like copy, okay? Except that it's not gonna create another instance of it, all right? You still have the constrain option. You can check that or uncheck that, but if you wanna move a wall, you simply define the location of where you wanna move that from, okay? Whether it be the center line, the face, so depending on what's most important to you, whether it's the outside distance or the inside distance, ultimately you have to make that determination of where you're moving from, okay? So just like copy, you just define the start distance or the start location, and then you can move it to whatever distance you would like, all right? Let's see, let's do another one. So the next one we're gonna talk about is mirror, okay? So mirror, let's say I want to mirror this wall in a certain direction, okay? So you have two different mirror options, all right? You have one called Mir Draw Axis, and you have one called Mir pick axis, okay? We're gonna start with draw axis, all right? So let's say I want to, let's put another wall in here really quickly. Let's say this is just some other wall on our project, and I want to mirror this wall in the exact same position, but on the other side of this wall, okay? So I'm gonna click on that wall. I'm gonna click on Mir Draw Axis. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to draw the axis line of where I want that wall to mirror over, okay? So if I want it to be in the exact same place on the other side of this wall, I'm simply going to draw an axis line on the middle of that wall, okay? And notice that the wall jumps over to the other side in the exact same place, okay? So that's gonna be the Mir Draw Axis tool. Now, the second tool is going to be Mir Pick Axis. So luckily in this situation, we actually already have a wall in place. So if the wall is already in place, theoretically, it will allow me to pick that wall as my axis, okay? So I can get the same result. So like Revit, usually there's a variety of solutions on how you can get to the end result. You can usually, if I wanted to, I could copy that wall over, I can mirror it over. You could typically get the same end result doing it 5 different ways, 10 different ways. But your goal is to figure out what's the quickest and best solution to doing that, okay? So become efficient. All right, so the difference between the two is maybe you have this wall to work with, you know an axis that you want to mirror it over, but you may not have that wall, okay? And that would be how you would define those 2 different instances. All right, let's look at a few more of our tools. So we have offset, okay? So here, just like the pick lines tool, you can define the amount of your offset. So whether it be 5 feet, I can go through here just like the pick lines tool, and I can start to offset that wall. Okay, pretty easy. It's probably not going to be easy at first. It makes sense watching it, and you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's just like AutoCAD, but using it is a different story. So it might make sense now, but it could become a little confusing later. That's okay. All right, we'll figure it out. Let's see. I'm going to go and look at a line here in just a few minutes. All right, I'll actually use a line when we start to add a couple different walls. So let's look at a few more of our different modification tools. The next one we're going to look at is this one right here called Split Element. Okay, so I'm going to click on my wall, and let's say you run into a situation where you want to actually break that wall in half. Okay, you want to break that wall in half. Maybe it ends up doing something different on both sides. Okay, so I'm going to click on the Split Element tool, and you'll notice that as I hover my cursor over, it defines a location of where that element is going to split. All right, so we'll just say I want to split it about the middle of that wall. All right, so now I actually have 2 separate walls. I could change this wall assembly to something else. Okay, so now I have 2 separate wall assemblies. I could do something where maybe I just want to move this up. Okay, so notice that when I moved that up, it actually still grabbed the adjacent wall and moved it up. Theoretically, they're still joined. Okay, those walls are still joined even though I split them apart. So what would we do if we want to actually move this wall up without moving the adjacent wall next to it? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that wall, and you're going to notice these little blue toggles at the end of that wall. Okay, so if I right click on that little blue toggle, or grip would actually be the technical term for that, there's a button up here that says Disallow Join. Okay, so I'm going to click on Disallow Join. In plan view, that's going to look exactly the same, but if I try to actually manipulate that wall now, so I try to now move it up, they're not joined together, so it'll actually allow me to split those walls apart without them moving with each other. So you will run into that situation, likely today, when you want to move a wall, but maybe those 2 walls are already joined. That's how you can prevent them from moving with each other. Okay, so I'm going to hit Control Z. Remember, Control Z just backs me up. Okay, it backs me up to a previous state. Let's see. Let's look at, I'm not going to go over every one of these tools today. Let's see. Let's look at one more, and what that's going to be is going to be Trim or Extend Element. All right. I'm going to put another wall over here, and we're going to go ahead and use the Trim Extend Element tool. So I'm going to click on this button right here. So the only difference between these two is one's going to be a single element and multiple elements. So maybe you want 50 walls to join with the wall that's further down, or maybe it's just one. That's the only difference between the two tools, okay? So I'm going to click on single element. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define the face that I want to extend to. So I'm going to click on that face right there, and then I'm going to click on the element that I want to extend. Notice that when I click on my wall, it gives you a little blue dashed line. It shows you where that's going to extend to. Okay, so I'll click on that, and then that wall extends. Okay, so yes, you could go like this, you could grab it, you could move it over to your wall, but the point is to learn the different modification tools so that you can become really efficient. Right now, the time savings of actually just dragging the wall over versus using the tool is probably negligible, but when you're actually thinking about it in terms of a grand scheme of a big project, all that time adds up. So, and where it would actually probably make the most sense is if you had lots of walls. Okay, you had lots of walls and you wanted to extend all of them, where you wouldn't want to go like this. Elevator music. You wouldn't want to do that. Okay, so you would use your trim multiple elements. I'm going to click on my face, and now I'm going to select all of the walls that I want to move. Okay, see how that worked? So nice and quick, nice, quick and efficient. So those are going to be our basic modify commands. The last one that I want to talk about is align. Okay, align becomes a very valuable tool that I use all the time. So right now we don't really have anything to align with, but let's create a scenario to where we would do that. I'm just going to create a wall, any random. Let's just pick this generic 6-inch line. Let's go ahead and I'm just going to draw a wall over here like so. And I'm going to go to my 3D view. All right, and let's just say that I want to align the face of this wall with the face of this wall. Okay, so I want them on the exterior face of my wall to be one single plane. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on the wall that I want to align. I'm going to click on my align tool. Okay, and the first step is going to be to define the surface or the plane that you want to align with. Okay, so if I go up here to my ribbon, you're going to see a tool that says prefer, and it's going to say wall center line. Okay, so right now the only thing that Revit is going to allow me to align with is center line to center line. Okay, so when we talked about wall location lines last class, we're starting to get back to them right now. Okay, so right now I could only align the center of this wall with the center of this wall. That's all that's going to help or allow me to do. But you may not want to do that. Let me find a marker, because I'm looking for an eraser. There we go. The reason why you wouldn't want to do center line to center line right now is because our lower wall is actually a 12-inch wall, and the wall that I just drew is a 6-inch wall. So if you align center line to center line, your wall is going to look like something like this. Right? Okay? So I want to align the exterior faces. All right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that to wall faces instead. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to define, I'm first going to click on the wall that I want to align with. Okay, then I'm going to click on the wall that I want to align. Okay, and then now notice, even though the only reason why these kind of clash is because I haven't defined my top constraint and my bottom constraint, but now my exterior faces, let's see, should be aligned. Actually, I don't think, are they? Really closely. Let me back that up one sec. Wall faces. I think the reason why is going to be faces of core. Okay, now it'll actually let me. The reason why it didn't let me before is because each of these wall assemblies are actually only a core right now. So it didn't know how to define that originally. But now if I go to faces of core, notice that I can actually click on the face, okay? I can now align it with the face of the wall below, and I can now click on the face of my new wall. So now, if I just move my wall up, now the faces of these two walls are exactly flush with each other. So yes, there's a gap on the inside. That's okay. You know, you can fur that out in the interior and make that correct. But ultimately, you want to be able to understand what do you want to align with and how to do that. Okay, any questions about the align tool? Good. And I'll do it again here soon. We're going to run into situations while we're building where we're going to want to do that. So you'll see a little bit more of a realistic situation of when you might use that align tool. All right.
What about the trim?
Say that again.
Trim tool.
Trim tool. This one right here.
Yeah.
How do we use it?
To delete, to delete any extra line or extra tool.
Oh, okay. Let me go back to level 1. So let's create a scenario where you might actually have that. So I'll create a line, or I'm sorry, a wall like that, and maybe it's like that. Okay, so you're saying, well, if I want to use the trim tool, how do you get rid of the extra wall?
Yeah.
Well, it'll actually automatically do that, whether this wall here is over here or it's over here. I'm going to click on my wall, click on trim, and what you're going to do is you're going to click, this is actually a great question, thank you for asking that. You're going to click on the two halves of the wall that you want to keep, okay? So if I'm trying to keep this portion of the wall and I want this wall, I'm going to click over here and I'm going to click over here, okay? So I'm going to click once and I'm going to click on this wall, and it gets rid of all of that and joins them at that corner. So knowing that, if I want to get rid of this side of the wall, I would click on this side of the wall and this wall, okay?
What if that wall went through? Like, if your vertical line went through the other wall?
Mm-hmm. It's okay. Let's try it.
So drag that all the way down, and then
Yeah.
you don't want that extra on the bottom anymore.
It would still do the same thing. It's gonna keep whatever two portions of the wall that you want, okay? So it'd work exactly the same. I'm gonna click on the two that I want to keep, and it gets rid of the other two. Okay, so it's always click on the two portions of the wall that you want to keep. That's the key to trimming correctly. All right, questions about that? Good question, thank you for asking that. Feel free to always ask if you realize that maybe I'm missing a little something, just let me know. There's 1,000 commands in this, and sometimes I will occasionally forget one little thing, so, or a couple things. So just bring it up, and I'm happy to continue to discuss that. So that's the trim tool. We'll talk about more of these a little bit later as we run into actual scenarios where we would use them. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so we talked about modify commands. Last class we talked about selection tools. Okay, so I'm going to skip that one for now. Let's talk about snaps a little bit. Okay, so for those of you that are familiar with AutoCAD, you're familiar with O snaps. Okay, you type in O snaps and you can define midpoints, endpoints, you know, in a whole variety of different points to which you can potentially snap to. Okay, so let's just say we have a couple walls here. I go up to architecture and I go over to wall. Well, unlike AutoCAD, you can't necessarily define what those snapping points are. Luckily for Revit, Revit will automatically try to find those points for you. It tries to define where you're trying to snap to. So notice that I'm trying to draw a new wall right now, and as I hover my mouse over certain portions of the wall that I'm working with, your mouse will snap to certain areas of that wall. So for example, as I get closer to the edge of my wall, notice that it snaps to that corner. All right, then it snaps to this corner. Well, it'll also snap to the midpoint. So if I keep moving my mouse down, boom, right there. It goes ahead and starts to snap to that midpoint of that wall. Okay, and then from there, I can start drawing. All right, so pretty easy. You can't check and uncheck where you want it to snap to, but Revit will automatically try to intelligently pick where those points that you're trying to snap to. Your mouse will kind of grab onto those areas of the wall. okay? All right, next. Let's talk about, I'm going to skip view tools for now. We're going to come back to that when we have a little bit more of our house assembled, where that will make a little bit more sense. Okay, same thing with graphic overrides. Lower ribbon we talked about last class. Okay, so we talked about what each of these items mean down here. We have our view scale. This is the scale that your view will ultimately be once you put it onto a sheet. Okay, and also how you see it on your screen. We talked about what each of these means also last class, and we're going to go into more details on that as we start to lay out our sheets, okay? Because a lot of these buttons will become more relevant once we actually start placing materials onto sheets that will plot. Yes?
For the scale, just a quick question.
Uh-huh.
For example, if we assemble it 1/4 of an inch to 1 foot,
Mhm.
so to speak, if we're gonna change the scale, can we change it in that project and say that?
Yes,
this is
you can change the scale of your project at any time.
Or will it cause any problems?
No, I mean it'll change the size of your annotations, because your annotations, the view is changing, so what you see on your screen is getting smaller and larger. And even though it looks like your annotations are actually getting smaller or larger, they're actually remaining the same size, and it's the architecture and everything else that's on your screen that's actually changing. So usually the only times I'm changing my scale mid-project, maybe I'm trying to put like a site plan or a floor plan onto a sheet and it's just too big, well, you're going to have to change the scale of your drawing so that it fits, okay? So we'll talk more about that a little bit later when we actually create sheets. Okay, next, detail versus model lines. So we briefly talked about this last class just a little bit on the differences between the two, but let's talk about detail versus model lines. So detail lines, if you go under architecture and you go over to the right under the tab that says model, you're going to notice some lines that say model lines. Okay, so what are the difference between model lines and detail lines? Model lines are actual physical lines that you will see in all of your views. So they work just like a wall or a window. It's actually a physical element that will show up in all of your views. Okay, so for example, if I click on model line and I just draw a couple of lines right here and I go to my 3D view, notice that those lines actually show up. So like a window or a door or a wall, they will show up in all of your views. Well, let's go back really quickly. When you draw a model line, so I click on model line, it asks you a placement plane. Okay, well if I click on this plane, well I can actually draw those lines on any particular datum point that we've created. So all of your levels, you can actually define what level you're drawing those lines at. Okay, so I just clicked on level 2. Notice that as I draw them, I can't see them because I'm actually in my level 1 floor plan. But if I go to my level 2 floor plan, let's see, or if I go to one of my plans above level 1, notice that those lines are actually above level 1. Okay, so you're actually defining a placement of where those lines are located. So model lines, unlike detail lines, are physical elements. Okay, you will see them throughout your project. All right. Whereas let's go back to level 1, and now I'm going to go over to annotate, and our second line type is called a detail line. So often I use detail lines as like reference lines. Sometimes I draw them all over my project. I just use them as a reference point. Well, it's also another way of drawing kind of simple CAD lines in your project, okay? So there will be times when you don't necessarily want to model a bolt or a screw that is going into something. Well, you would just use some basic general line work to define those things, because you're not going to model every tiny little thing. But if you want to use some lines to kind of create for reference in your project, you would use detail lines. Okay, detail lines, unlike model lines, I can draw them in my view. They are only view specific. So when I draw them, they are only going to be seen in the view that you drew them in. Okay, if I go look at another view, you don't see them. They're only going to be in the view that you draw them in. Okay, so if I go to any one of my other floor plans, or I go to sections or elevations, you're not going to see those lines. Whereas a model line, you would actually see in all of your different views. Okay, So one more thing when it comes to those lines, for both detail lines and model lines, if you click on any one of them, if you go over to the right, you're going to notice something that says line style. Well, this is going to be where you have all of your different line types. So like AutoCAD, you have various line weights, right? So you have various line weights. So right here, as a default, as a part of this architectural template, it gives you just a couple basic line styles. Okay, so you have a hidden line, which is basically a dash line. Overhead, if you guys are familiar with architectural drawings and something is overhead, it's represented by a dash line. So if I click on that overhead and I draw, that's going to be a different line type. Well, if you go to my office and you open up your detail lines and you click on line style, we actually have like 150 different line styles. I'm going to have line weights 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 16. They all represent different weights of lines depending on what I'm trying to achieve. Okay, so for what we do in this class, what you see here is all you're going to need. Okay, you're not going to need anything more than this, but they give you a thin line, a medium line, and a wide line. So those are various different line weights that you can work with. Okay, so kind of like when we were working in our different modification tools for our walls, well, you're going to have a very similar set of modification tools for your detail lines. Okay, so let's say, let me just change this back to lines. Okay, so let me just draw a few different lines here. Well, you're going to be able to use the same modification tools for your line work. Okay, so the trim command still works exactly the same for your line work. So if you really wanted to, you could almost do CAD. You could do CAD work in Revit. You could just start drawing lines all over the place if you want to. And sometimes I do that. Sometimes I just know I don't need to physically model it, and I can just draw some quick line work, and that will suffice. Okay. So just like your different, when you're drawing walls, you'll have all the same modification tools along with another set of modification tools. All right, so if I click on detail lines, you're also going to have all of these different draw tools. So you have basic lines, rectangles, okay? We have polygons, circles, and when you're drawing walls too, you have the same capabilities. You'll have all these same different wall tools, okay? So, and various other different types of lines, okay? So if I go back over to wall, you'll notice the same different draw tools, okay? So maybe you want to draw squares, you can do that, circles, okay? So you have all the same tools that you would use when drawing walls or drawing lines. They all work exactly the same. Okay, any questions about that? Yes?
Can you draw on the actual wall itself, like on the face of the wall?
Yes, great question. So later on in class, we're gonna talk about reference planes a little bit later, but let's just say I go to my 3D view. So what he's saying is, what if I wanted to draw on the face of this wall? Well, you could do that. So I'm going to go over to, let's go to model lines, okay? So we'll use a model line. We'll say that we're going to end up wanting to see this in actual elevation. Well, let's see. Where is my change? Give me just one sec. Okay, so under architecture, you're going to see a button called work planes. We'll actually get into work planes. This is a whole lecture talk, is talking about work planes, but just in a quick nutshell. If I click on set work plane and I go to pick a plane and I hit OK, I can actually define what plane I'm working on. Okay, so this will make a lot more sense once we actually start drawing physical elements on those planes. But just to answer your question, if you wanted to draw something, let's say on this face, I can change my work plane to a specific face. So I'm going to click on that face, and now if I go to model lines, as I draw things, I'm actually drawing on the face of the object that I just selected. Okay, see that? Those lines are actually located on that face. Okay. You may still have more questions on this. That's okay, because it honestly is a whole lecture that we're going to do here in a couple weeks. But that's essentially how that works. So any questions at all about any of the different drawing tools? Drawing tools, modification tools. Okay, it's gonna take practice. It's gonna take probably several weeks to the point where you're drawing walls kind of efficiently. Okay, so it will take time. It will be a little frustrating at first, but it'll become easier and easier as you start to draw. Okay, moving on. 11 o'clock, so we still got some time. Let's move down. We talked about understanding hierarchy last class. We talked about model versus view specific elements. So remember, model elements are things like walls, doors, items that you can actually physically touch. So like model lines, those items will always show up in every view, versus view specific elements, which are going to be annotative elements, things just like basic lines, text, dimensions. Those are all view specific elements. Okay, so that's going to go ahead and finish talking about just generic. That'll finish talking about modification tools and walls. So we're going to move on to some new material. We're going to start to talk about some different structural elements. Okay, so let's talk about creating a structural grid. Okay, so typically, kind of in a new project, one of the initial steps of drawing is establishing your structural grid. Okay, we're not actually going to create a structural grid for our project quite yet, but we'll talk about how to do that. All right, so I'm going to go to my level 1. All right, and what we're going to do is we're going to go over to architecture. You can actually do this in both architecture or structure. All right, notice if you go down here to datum that you have the button grid, you have that under structure, and you have it under architectural. Okay, so we're going to click on grid, and just like drawing a level line, it works exactly the same way. Okay, so let's just say our first grid line is going to be on the face of this wall, well, or the center of this wall, depending on how you work. Okay, so we'll say it's the center of the wall. Well, I could draw that structural grid line right there. I could draw it because it'll snap to the center of that wall. And just like our level lines, you can turn off the grid bubbles on both sides. Basically, how these grid lines works exactly the same way as our level lines. Okay, there's not a whole lot different. If you want to jog the little bubble, you can do it the same exact way as you did with the level line. Okay, so typically you're going to have like a 1, 2, 3 in one direction, and in the other direction you might have A, B, C, D. Okay, so again, I'm going to click on grid, and I'm going to use my offset tool. Let's just say we want, like, I don't know, 10-foot grid offsets. So just like level lines, I can go ahead and define that. So I'm going to click on 10 feet, and I can offset it. Actually, the 10 feet was almost exactly the middle of our building. So we're not really going to be creating much of a grid for this project, but this actually kind of works. So I'm going to click on 10 feet, and I'm going to click on that line. Notice that when I create the next grid line, it calls it 2. Okay, so it will continue to create them in the order that you initially start. So I'll go ahead and do that again, and that'll be our third grid line. All right, so we'll just say those are our 3, 1, 2, and 3. Well, let's create our other grid lines in the opposing direction. We're going to click on grid, and we'll say it's about right there. All right, well, notice that it changed it to 4. Well, we're not going to want that 4. We're going to want to change that to, we'll say, A. So if I click on that grid and I go to, and I type in A, okay, that will change that. I can add my grid bubble over here. And now notice that when I add the next one, we'll just say 10 feet again, and I click on my pick lines tool, notice that it calls it B. Okay, so it's predicting what the next level will be. Just like when you're creating level lines and it makes it level 3, 4, 5, 6, it will do the same thing when you are creating your grid lines. Okay, so B, C, D, E, etc., etc. Yes, that's a lot of grid lines for this tiny little project, but that should show you essentially how we're going to create them. Okay, so that's how we're going to create grid lines. We'll actually put them to work a little bit later in the class when we talk about structural elements like columns, beams. Okay, we'll actually talk about how those actually work. Any questions about grid lines? Okay, pretty easy, pretty intuitive, yeah. Let's look at our next element, what we're going to be working with. So let's talk about foundations, okay? So if we scroll down to the first object or the first step in this week's residence exercise, we're gonna be working on a little bit of foundation work, okay? So what we're gonna be doing is we're gonna be adding footings to the bottom of our walls, okay? Yes?
Question.
Uh-huh.
The little piece, the one that looks like a bracket, is it supposed to be showing up on level 1 blueprint? Because it's not showing up like what it is there. It's like
This right here?
The other one, the little small piece. That one.
This one over here?
Is it supposed to show up like this?
Well, you're not gonna see it on level 1 because it's actually, I think it's actually above level 1. Or it's below.
I think it's below.
Okay. Yes. You, let's see, let me look at mine.
You see it.
That one right there. The small piece. On the
This
right.
one over here? Or this one?
The one on the right.
This one right here.
Yes.
So if we click on this wall right here, right now, let's see, the base constraint is actually, let's see, subfloor, and it goes up to level 1. So yes, you will see it because the top of that wall is actually, let's see. You may not see it. How many people here do not see these 3 walls in their view right now? Okay, so I'll show you the reason why I actually see it. So these are all good questions. These questions lead to basically how to fix that. So that's a good question. So the reason why that I see it is because I've actually adjusted my view parameters. Okay, I've adjusted the depth of how far I can see in my view. So if you don't see something, which you will run into many times when you don't see an object that you're hoping to see. So right now, if I click on this wall type, it says that the top constraint is actually 3/4 of an inch below level 1. Well, theoretically, you shouldn't see it because it's actually below level 1, okay? But for what I'm doing, I wanted to actually see that. Okay, so I wanted to change my view parameters so that I could see those walls. Well, if you go over to your properties dialog box in level 1, so we're in our level 1 floor plan, I'm going to go over and I'm going to click on, down here under extents, I'm going to click on the button that says view range. Okay, so I'm going to click on view range.
It doesn't show up here on the screen.
If you go to the very bottom, you're going to see a little box. It says properties. Click on that. I'm sorry. Click on project browser. So you're going to go to level 1. And now, if you go to your properties, you'll see that view range. Okay. So if you guys, a lot of you guys probably know this, but by default, when you have a floor plan, the floor plan is typically cut 4 feet above that level, correct? So it's cut, do we all know why it's cut 4 feet above that level? Why are most floor plans shown at 4 feet?
To show the walls.
Yes, but more to that as well. Does anyone know why most floor plans are typically cut at 4 feet? The reason that they're cut at 4 feet is because yes, you're going to see a lot of your walls, but most window sills are actually below 4 feet as well, so they're usually at like 2.5, 3 feet. So the cut plane is usually at 4 feet, so that you see things like countertops, you see things like windows, you see furniture. So all of that stuff is typically below the 4 foot level. But if you were doing like wall cabinets that are like above your sink, you wouldn't see them in the floor plan because they're actually above the cut plane, okay? So if I go over to my properties dialog box for level 1 and I click on view range, you can control what you see in your floor plan. So you can actually adjust, that to whatever you want. And by default, that should say 7'6", so that's the top of the view, okay? And they add that so that if you have things like cabinets that are above your sink, it'll actually show a dashed line that shows the objects that are above. So this is telling you the view range of everything that you can see in your view, okay? So the cut plane for my level 1 right here, cut plane for level 1 is at 4 feet because that's the default. We're cutting it at 4 feet. All right, the bottom of my view is at 0 feet. So that's the bottom of my view. But I've changed my view depth so that I see everything minus 8 feet from level 1. So I've changed it to allow myself to be able to see those 3 walls. So if I was to actually change that to 0 and I hit apply, I'm hoping this works. Those 3 walls should go away. Does that make sense on why they're going away? Because the top constraint of those 3 walls is actually minus 3/4 of an inch from level 1. So here's our level 1 floor plan. Okay, so level 1. That wall actually goes just below that line. Okay, so that dimension is 3/4 of an inch. That's why that when I change that to 0, basically I'm only seeing everything up to that point. I'm not seeing what's below that. Does that make sense?
Don't forget to put the negative sign in front of it.
Yes.
We'll throw an error.
Negative sign. So if I go back to -8 feet, theoretically I could say negative 3/4 of an inch, and I would see that. Okay, so apply. Maybe not. That's actually the surface. Let's try 1 inch. So now I can see that because I've now extended my view range to below the actual view. Okay? So if you don't see those walls and you want to see those walls, that's how you can fix that. Okay? Any questions about view range? Okay? Moving on. Next topic. So let's see, what were we talking about before? We were talking about adding a foundation, okay? So to add a foundation to these bottom 3 walls, okay, so we have 3 walls that we're gonna add a foundation to. We're gonna add a footing. I'm actually gonna do this in 3D, and you'll notice over time that I actually like to do a lot of my work in 3D, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go over to structure, and I'm going to go over to right here, structural foundation wall. Sorry, I'm rethinking my decision here really quickly. Make sure that I'm doing, okay, this is correct. So I'm gonna click on structural foundation wall, and all you simply have to do is select the walls that you want to add the footing to. So I select that wall, and notice that it just automatically adds the footing to the bottom of that wall. Okay, and if I continue to go around and select the adjoining walls, notice that it automatically joins them together. Okay, so that's really it for adding those foundations. But let's just take it a little bit further, and you're not going to have to do this in class, but you may have to do this in your professional environment, is how might you edit that footing. Okay, so if I click on that footing, actually, I may come back to this. This could be like a 10-minute exercise that I want to be cautious on our time. But basically, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at how to edit the profile of that footing. So right now, the profile of that footing is a simple rectangle. So it's just this. Basically, you're just defining the dimensions of that footing, whether it be like 4 feet by 2 feet or something like that. That's basically what you want to be able to change. And to do that, let's just do this really quickly. So right here, if I go over to my properties, remember if you click on any object in your scene, it will tell you the properties of that object. So I'm going to click on that footing, and I'm going to go over here to edit type. Okay, and when I go to edit type, notice that the type is a bearing footing 36 inches by 12 inches. Well, if I wanted to create a new one with different dimensions, what would be the first step? Duplicate, right. Because we don't want to edit this one. There might be, these footings somewhere else in the project. So I'm going to go to duplicate, and maybe we want to create a 48 inch by 24 inch footing. Okay, so I'm going to hit OK, and now I can change the dimensions of that footing right here. All right, so width, I'm going to make that 4 feet. And foundation thickness, I'm going to say 2 feet. And that's going to be it. Okay, up here you have a button called structural material. So if you want to change the material to something other than concrete, you can do that. I can't imagine of what else you'd want to change it to. You're not going to want to change it to plastic or foam, because then it's not going to do its jobs. Most of the time our footings are made out of concrete. So we're just going to leave that in place. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And notice that our footing now changes in size, okay? But we still have two other footings that have not changed. So if I click on those two other footings, I can go over here to my properties dialog box and I can change them to any one that I've created, okay? So by default, Revit gives you a 36 by 12 and a 24 by 12 by 12. So I'm going to click on the one that I just created, 48 by 24, and now they will all match. Okay, everyone see how we do that? Questions? Good, pretty easy, pretty self-explanatory. Let's see. Actually, let's go back. I'm gonna go ahead and put that on the one by the default. The default that it comes with for what you're doing today will work just fine. You don't have to change them unless you want to for whatever reason, but the default that Revit gives you, that's all you need for this project. Let's see,
What's the command to select more than one piece?
okay, let's look at that. So she's asking, what is the command to select more than one piece? Well, there's a couple different ways, and we talked a little bit about this on our first day, but let's go over that again. So if I want to select all of these three foundational elements, I can do it a couple different ways, okay? I can click on the first one, and if I hold down Control, notice that my cursor, there's a little plus sign above my cursor, so I can now go through and select as many other elements as I want, okay? If I want to add more, I can add more, okay? So I'm going to select the first one, hold down Control. Notice over here in my Properties dialog box that it says 2, Structural Foundation 2. That's telling me that I have 2 structural foundation elements selected currently. Okay, and every time I add one, you know, that number goes up. If I start to add things that are not structural foundation members, you're going to notice that it all goes gray, okay? Because you don't have 3 of the exact same things selected. But if I click on this little box, it'll actually tell me all of the different things that are currently active. It's saying that I have 3 structural foundations selected. I have 1 wall. My 3D view is activated, so it's telling me that I have of every object that I can currently have selected. All right, another way to select them all. Let's say you want to select all of those foundational elements at once. I'm going to hover my mouse. Notice I'm not selecting anything yet. I'm going to hover my mouse over that element, and I'm going to hit the Tab button. Oh, let's see. Maybe that's not going to work. Okay. What I was thinking actually does not work for structural foundation elements, but if I hover my mouse over this wall right here and I hit the Tab button, notice that it selects all of the adjoining walls around it. So just another selection method of how you might select several things at one time. Okay. What's another way we could select a variety of different elements? It's something we talked about in the first class. It's click and drag. So yes, you could click and drag and you could select, elements like so. So what's the difference between clicking and dragging to the left versus clicking and dragging to the right?
Left, you select everything inside the box.
Correct. So if I start and I click and I drag, notice that everything that my my extents boundaries is going through, it selects it, okay? All right, so as soon as that extents boundary hits this wall in the upper corner, it's now a part of that selection, okay? Now, what's the difference by going from left to right?
We'll select specific elements.
Notice that as I go through this first element, it's not selecting it, okay? It will only select it when that element is completely inside of that selection box, okay? So notice that it's not selecting the elements in my screen until that entire element is within inside my selection marquee, okay? So that's the difference between selecting, going from left to right, right to left. It's just like AutoCAD. That is a common feature of AutoCAD and Revit.
I noticed when you went from left to right and you didn't highlight the second wall,
Mm-hmm.
it didn't highlight until you also included the foundation.
Let's see. Well, I think the reason why Okay, so right there, the foundation's actually not selected, just because I'm probably like just a tiny bit from actually selecting it. So it should. It's so close and so interconnected, it's almost hard not to select the foundation as well. Okay, so what's our last selection option? Control, actually, I didn't know about that one. No, I don't think so. I was gonna say, is that one that I don't know about? There's another selection tool that is very valuable. We talked about it on the first day. What might that be? Does anybody remember the filter option? Filter, okay. I think it's actually on here under selection tool, selection filter. So let's talk about what the filter does. Okay, remember that if we want to select, let's say we select everything that's inside of our scene right now, but I only want to select certain elements, you can go up here under the, as soon as you select them, I can go up and click on filter, and it will actually tell me every item that I have selected, okay? So right now it doesn't really work that well because I only have like 7 items in my scene. But when we demonstrated it last class, I actually used the sample project and where there were thousands of items in the scene, okay? There was furniture, there was floor assemblies, wall assemblies, roof assemblies, there was just all kinds of items in our scene. Well, a lot of times it's difficult to select one specific object or maybe a group of specific objects. Maybe you don't want to maybe you only want to select just these concrete walls, but you don't want to go through and select every one of them. Right now it's kind of easy because we only have like 6 of them, but you might be in a project where you have 100 of them. And I can go like this, I could click on filter, and I could simply uncheck foundations, and now I only have my walls selected. Okay, so by clicking on filter, it allows you to filter out the things that you don't want to select. Okay, let's talk about one more selection tool that I did not bring up last class. Okay, and so let's say another way to select all of these walls at the same time. If I click on this wall right here and I right click, there's going to be a button called Select All Instances. Okay, and you're going to have 2 options. One's going to be all of those instances. All of those instances that are visible in my view and in the entire project. Well, right now, those would technically be the same because I only have like 8 objects in my scene. Everything that I could see in my view is everything that I have in my project. So they're going to do the exact same thing. But you might be in a scenario where you only want to select the objects that are in your floor plan. Well, that's what you could do. But if I click on this, right click on Select All Instances, Visible in View, notice that it selected all of the walls that are of that wall type. So those are all basic wall foundation, 12-inch concrete. Those are all the same wall type. So that's an easy way to select all of something that are exactly the same. Okay? So just another selection tool. Yes?
Can you repeat again?
I'm sorry?
Can you repeat again?
Sure. So what I want to do is, let's just say I want to select all. This is a concrete foundation wall. I want to select all of those walls in my scene right now. Okay? Well, I could right click on it and I could go through and I could click on all of those walls like so. But that could become tedious, right? We don't necessarily always want to do that. So I can click on it once, right click, and I can go to Select All Instances, Visible in View. And that would select all of those.
What about the white?
This one right here?
Yeah, this and
That's actually a different wall. So that's the reason why. So depending on how you modeled this first step, I modeled it
So it selects
the same type. Okay, so this is it's only selecting the foundation walls, 12-inch concrete. This is a different wall. That's why it did not select that. So any questions about selection tools? Okay, any questions? Yes?
Okay, on your filter option, is there a way to create subgroups? Because, if you have, it says 9 walls,
Yes.
but say 5 of them are composite, 6 of them are, granite, 6 of them are, plaster. Is there a way to get subgroups?
Unfortunately, not. So every selection tool kind of has its pros and its cons. They all do stuff that maybe others don't do, but no, you cannot.
Got it.
Yes, in the back.
Where do you find the filter option?
So you're not going to see it until you've selected the objects in your scene. So I'm going to select my objects in my scene, and up here in your ribbon, you're going to see a button that says filter towards the right-hand side. You see that? Not seeing it yet?
Okay, so the reason why you don't see it is because you only have one object selected. Let's select both those walls.
Yeah. And there you go.
Offset.
Okay. So it's not going to pop up unless you have more than one object, because you wouldn't filter just one object. All right, let's see. Moving on. Let's look at a couple other different. Let's see if there's anything that I missed. I think that's a majority of what we have here. Creating interior, exterior walls. We got one more very, very important thing to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit more about creating new materials, okay? So you'll be doing that in next week's critical thinking exercise. You'll be creating new materials. And you've probably even had a couple instances this morning when you were working on the critical thinking exercise when you needed to create some new materials, okay? So let's look at that. All right, so let's create a wall. And I'm going to start out with a generic 6-inch wall, and we're going to create some new materials, all right? So there's a couple ways you could do this. The first way is by either selecting the wall, going to Edit Type, and then you go to Edit Structure. And so this morning when we were working on the critical thinking exercise, there were some times when the material that you were looking for did not exist, right? So Revit gives you a bunch, but it doesn't give you all of them. And there will be times when maybe you want to create a material to specifically represent a product that you're actually using, okay? So an example of that, a perfect example of what that might be is I'm currently working on shopping center for my office, to where I have a specific manufacturer of brick that says that we want to use. We really like this really cool brick. We like the way that it looks. Well, in our elevations, we want to show that exact brick. We don't want to just show a generic brick, because when you get to the fine details of, the overall aesthetics of this building, we all know there's hundreds of types of brick. Okay, so I want to actually show a product that I'm working on. Okay, so I'm going to break this into two different categories, kind of a more simple and a more complicated material that we're going to create. So this morning, you probably had to create a metal stud. I think that's one that's not in there. I don't think plaster is in there, and I don't think, what was another one? Mortar was in there. I think those are three materials that were not a part of the defaults in Revit. Okay, so one way that you could create that is by going over here to your material, and let's say that we're going to create a metal stud. I can go and click on the materials. That opens up my material browser. Okay, that opens up the material browser, and from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to this little button that says creates and duplicates materials. Okay, so I am going to click on that button, and I'm going to click on create new material. And I'll talk about the difference between duplicating and creating a new material in just a second. Okay, so I'm going to click on create new material, and what that does, it's just like when you go and click on duplicate. It's kind of funny because I'm actually saying not to click on duplicate, but essentially what it's doing is it's giving you a nice material from scratch that has no properties tied to it whatsoever. So whatever you do to this material, it's not going to affect any of the other materials in the project. Okay, so let's create the plaster. Okay, so what I'm going to do when I created the new material, it says default new material. So it's just gray. That's all it is. There's nothing to it. So I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to click on rename, and I'm going to call this cement plaster. Okay, and where did it go? Let's see. It's in alphabetical order, so it just moved it into its right place. Well, really, it's still nothing right now. Besides me changing it, there's nothing different between that default material that we had and what I have now, besides the fact that I've just changed the name. Okay, so we have to start identifying it with a couple different properties. So we have to give it some elements that actually make it cement plaster. So there's two things that we're going to do. we're going to go over to graphics. If we need to give it any surface patterns or cut patterns, you can do that here, okay? So we're going to give it a surface pattern. So we're going to click on pattern, and we're going to go down, and we're going to click on gypsum plaster. So while we're here, let's talk about the two different types of patterns that we have in Revit. We have a drafting pattern, and we have a model pattern. Well, drafting patterns are simple, just hatches, okay? And those hatches will get smaller and larger depending on the scale of your view, okay? So if you are working on, let's say, like a detail view that's like 3 inches to a foot, well, you're gonna see a really dense pattern, okay? Because you're zoomed in high into it. To whereas if you're really far out, that pattern is gonna be much more subtle, okay? So depending on the scale of your view will ultimately determine what that pattern looks like. So I'm going to click on cement plaster and hit OK. Let's go back and look at some of our other patterns. So we also have patterns called model patterns. So notice here it starts to define specific dimensions. We have 12-inch tile, 3-inch parallel lines, 4-inch parallel lines, 4-inch tile, 6-inch tile. You know, CMU block, we have brick, we have different wood flooring patterns. Well, these patterns are different in the fact that they will always remain the same size no matter what the scale, okay? So if I have brick on the exterior of my building, I don't want the size of that brick pattern to change. I want that brick to always be, you know, 4 by 8 inches by 4 inches, or whatever the size of your brick is, okay? I want it to always remain the same size, okay? If I have 6-inch planks of wood flooring, well, I might want to change the scale of my floor plan, but I still want my planks to be 6 inches. I don't want those to change. So drafting versus model view. Drafting will change depending on the scale of your drawing. Model patterns will always remain the size that it states here in Revit, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and hit cancel, and I'm gonna go ahead and keep that gypsum wall pattern, all right? That's good for now. So those are just gonna be the general graphics that you see in a hidden line view, okay? So hidden line view, that's your basic view that you would see in construction documents, black and white line work, that's all that is. Now, if we go over to appearance, this is going to be what you see in a realistic view or in a rendering, okay? So this is where you can actually start to import different texture maps into your project. This is where I would actually import the image of that brick or that material that I actually want into my project, okay? So right now it's just gray, but let's say I actually want to see the cement plaster. In my realistic view, I want to see kind of that coarseness look of the cement plaster. So if I click on this box right here that says image, okay, what that's going to do, it's going to take you to a place where you could select those materials. What's kind of funny about Revit is that when you click on that box, it never takes you to, Revit actually has a library of like thousands of materials that you can pick, but for some reason, this is just kind of a quirk with Revit, it never takes you to that place by default, okay? So I'm gonna tell you a little workaround, and this will save you lots of headaches and lots of workaround, or lots of problems in the future. So if you ever click on that box, and it takes you to, what it actually takes you to is it takes you to the last place that you are looking at in your Explorer. Okay, that's where it takes you. So an easy workaround is if you actually go to a material that already has an image map already associated. For example, I click on carpet. Well, there's already an image map associated for that carpet, okay? If I click on that right here on the link, it actually takes me to the folder where there's like thousands of materials in there. If I click on that link and I hit cancel and I go back to cement plaster and I click on that again, notice that I'm now in the folder where all those materials are, okay? So I'm gonna make this really big for now because we're gonna see all the different materials. I'm gonna change this from views to thumbnails, okay? And now you can see all of the different materials that Revit has already preloaded into the software, okay? So you can see here that we have probably about 25 different types of wood flooring, okay? It gives you about 20 different types of brick that you might use, okay? So although Revit does give you like 1,000 materials to pick from, and I'm not exaggerating when I say there are at least that in here, you will run into situations where that's not what you want. So it gives you 20 different types of brick, but I want to use the exact brick that I'm using on my project, okay? So for cement plaster, let's find that. Sometimes it could be a little bit difficult to find, I will admit that, okay? Because you can't unfortunately search now that we're in this location. So I think it's going to be under finishes. Let's see. Let's make this even bigger. Let's find cement plaster. It will be in here. Are you saying, how did I get here?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it one more time. So the first time we clicked on this, it actually brought me to the last place that I looked on my Explorer, which was my thumb drive. That's not where it's located. And of course, all of the materials are located into like the depths of your C drive. It's in like 17 folders deep into the drive and you'll never find it. So all you have to do is click on another material that already has a material already loaded into that project. And if I click on that link, simply close out of it, go back to my material that I want to add it to, and then click on it again, it's going to bring me to that location. If you want to write this down too, you can write that down. But that's where all those materials are located. But that's an easy way of finding it without having to click on program files, click on common files, Autodesk shared, and that gets annoying after.
And that's because you just created the last thing you looked at.
Yes, exactly. I just created a new location of where to look. Okay, so let's find cement plaster real quick. It might be under. Oh, sometimes it's difficult to find them. I think it might be under thermal barriers. Let me go down to the bottom.
You don't have a search in here?
It does not give you a search, unfortunately.
Oh, that's
I know. Sometimes it might take you a few minutes to find the material that you're looking for, but there are tons of materials in here. You can you can find some really nice one. They give you like 20 different types of grass, 20 different types of pebbles that you might put into, some different site work. Roofing, and there's everything that you can imagine is in here. So we just have to find cement plaster. It's in here somewhere.
It's not under C, it's under P.
Okay.
plaster cement.
Let's see. We'll find it. We will find it. We will find it.
Does it give different plaster textures as well?
Yes, but they classify it as something other than plaster. I could take the easy route and just make it brick, but
Stucco? Maybe it's under stucco.
oh yeah, it might be under S, under stucco. Site work, site paving. Let's see. Where are you? Where are you? We will find it. I know it exists because I've selected it before. Ah, right here. Found it. It's under finishes. Okay? So right here, we have a variety of different plasters. We have finishes, plaster, stucco, fine, browns. They even give you like fine, medium, and coarse types of plaster. There's a variety of different things that you can choose from. Okay? So I'm just going to, select plaster, stucco, fine, brown. So when you guys are navigating this materials catalog, you're going to notice two different types of materials, okay? You're going to notice one like this one that tells you what the material is, and right next to it, you're going to notice the exact same thing, but at the end, it says .bump. Okay, does anyone have an idea of what that is? What that is, it actually gives you a texture to add on top of your first texture that when you render, it actually gives some depth to that texture, okay? It gives it some pop so that you're not just looking at a flat image of brick. It actually allows you to see kind of the, the coarseness of, of the mortar or of the grout, joints. So it actually gives some pop to that rendering. So we'll talk about that at a later time when we actually get to that point. So I'm just going to click on this one right here. We'll click on brown plaster, and that's what our wall will look like when we go into a realistic form. Okay? So technically I would have actually added that plaster to the finish, to that layer. Okay, I'm just gonna hit OK for now. And let's look at this in let's look at this in realistic. Okay, so you can see here that there's actually a texture now to that wall. Yes?
If you're not gonna add it to the outer layer as a finish, for example, exterior or interior, it's gonna assume that you want the whole thing included.
Exactly. So now let's change this. Let's change it to the actual correct situation. Okay, so you notice that by changing I just added the cement plaster layer to the stud, it changes the entire wall, inside and out, which you probably wouldn't want because you don't want cement plaster on the inside of your bedroom or something like that, okay? So if I go back and I edit that, edit type, I'm going to go ahead and insert this. I'm going to go up. Let's make that a finish. I'm going to select my cement plaster. Let's make that an inch thick. We can make this, we'll make this a wood stud. Hit OK. And let's even add a material for the inside. We'll call that finish, and we're going to call this gypsum wallboard. Can you guys not talk right now, please? So we're going to go to gypsum wallboard, and we're going to hit OK. So we have a cement plaster finish on the exterior, wood stud, and gypsum wallboard. We're going to hit OK. Oh, whoops. So you'll get that layer. It will tell you if you did something wrong or if there's something that doesn't make sense. All right, so we'll hit OK, OK. And now notice that the exterior of our wall has cement plaster. Our stud is still just whatever we originally defined it as. And the inside is just white gypboard. Okay? So you can see how this becomes kind of tedious, but it's important that once you create them, you're only going to create it one time. So that's the nice thing about using the same file throughout the entire residence, is that once you create these wall types once, you're going to have them for the rest of the project. Okay, so and as you define them and you actually put attention to detail in defining the wall types correctly, you're not going to have to go into your project later and start adding all that stuff. So when you actually create like a rendering of the inside of your building, it actually looks correct. If you skip those steps and you're like, okay, I can't see the interior of my building, so what do I care what the material is? Well, you might not. So depending on what you're doing, you may not care what the material is on the inside. And a lot of what I do at my office, I don't care because I'm only building the shell of the building. So you ultimately have to ask yourself, to what level of detail do you need to model these walls? But for this project that we're working on now, we're creating a residence. We're creating a residence to where we care about the exterior. We're also going to be doing interior renderings as well. So it's important to understand what it looks like on the inside. All right, so that's about it. And just really quickly, the last thing that we're going to do is the other way that you can create materials. If you go up to manage, you can also just click on materials and you could do the exact same thing. That's just another way to access that material browser. Okay, actually let's do one more quick thing. All right, so let's just put in the scenario where you want to add in your own texture map. Okay, let's say you don't like all 1,000 of those materials that are inside that list. Okay, well, I'm going to go to Google and I'm going to type in seamless brick texture. Okay, well, here's a whole bunch more. Okay, so I could go to my brick manufacturer's website and they will give you this image right here. Okay, so this is just an example of, I'm keeping it a little simple, but I could go to the McNear brick website and I could actually download the exact brick that I want. But let's just pretend that I want this brick right here. This is the brick I want to use on the exterior of my building. Okay, so I'm going to go to View Image. It's going to give me that brick texture. And notice that when I searched that brick texture, I typed in the word seamless. Okay, does anyone know why I typed in the word seamless?
Otherwise you'll get seams in all your images.
Yes, exactly. So if you don't type in seamless, you could get just a generic brick picture. you're just going to see a bunch of boxes all over the exterior of your building. So by clicking on seamless, what that actually is doing is this edge actually connects to this edge over here. So when they combine those patterns in Revit, it looks like one seamless pattern. Okay? So I'm going to right click. I'm going to save this image as, and ideally I would save it to my thumb drive. I already have a bunch of these on my thumb drive, so I'm not going to do that. But for the next critical thinking exercise, you'll need to do this, okay? So I'm just going to save it to my desktop for now. I'll type this, we'll call this brick pattern 1. Hit save, and there it is. So I've saved it to my desktop, and now I'm going to go in here and I'm going to click on create new material. I'm going to change this, rename. I'm going to change this to brick pattern 1. All right, so brick pattern 1. I'm going to go over to appearance. I can now click on that little box. I know that pattern is on my desktop. Okay, so I can click on desktop, and there's my pattern right there. So I can click on that pattern. That's what I want. I'm going to hit open. Okay. The last question you have to ask yourself is, what is the scale of that pattern? Okay, so right now that image could come in at whatever scale you want, but when you actually look at it in 3D, you want those bricks to be the actual brick size. Okay, so if I double click on that image, there it is. Okay, you can see here that it's given us a couple things. Let's say in that this image, when I look at it in realistic view, is going to be 1 foot from here to here. Well, if that's actually the case, that means that each of these bricks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that means that each of those bricks are like 1.5 inches tall or something like that. Well, that's not the scale of our brick. So if we know we have 10 layers of brick, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and a brick, we'll just say nominal brick dimension is 4 inches. Well, that height of that image should be roughly 40 inches, right? So I'm going to go over down to the bottom, click on this little arrow. I'm going to go down to scale, and I'm going to change the height of that to 40 inches. Okay, so now each of those bricks is 4 inches tall. If you want to get super technical, you could calculate the mortar joint and you could add all that in there, but theoretically, that this is probably close enough. No one's going to actually measure that.
Just a quick question. How did you get the texture editor?
How did I get the texture editor to open up? If I just double click on the texture, it will open it up. Okay, and so from there, you can adjust the width, the height. By default, these are always linked. Okay, so if you change one to 3'4", it's going to change the other one. If you want to change one something different than the other, you can just uncheck that link, and I can now adjust the width. So I could probably figure out 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, so it's actually about the same. So I'm going to go ahead and click on done, and I'm going to hit OK. All right, so now I have that new pattern. So if I go over to this wall over here, and let's say I want to put that brick on my wall, I can go to Edit Type, and I'm going to select this finish, and I'm going to go up to brick pattern 1. That's my new material that I just created. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to hit OK again. And now I have this nice wall with this nice brick on it. Okay? So you could see where that becomes really important. So if I'm selecting a specific product from a manufacturer, I want to actually show that in my design drawings, because that's all, you know, all these tiny details are all a part of the overall design of the building. Yeah. There is not an option to make it seamless. You have to find that pattern. So I could, in Google, I'm going to type in the word seamless when looking for a brick texture. If I just type in brick texture, a lot of these might already be seamless, but a lot of them probably aren't seamless. Like this right here is probably not seamless. I would bet a bunch of money that it's not seamless. But let's just really quickly, I'm just going to save this. I'm going to import this into that pattern. Let's just see what that looks like. Let's see how that turns out. Oops, sorry. Let's click on the link. Let's select that new brick pattern. This should not be seamless. It's probably close enough. It's probably actually a little small. I'm gonna say it's about 5 feet. Done. Okay. 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 So can you see that now? Can you see the seam in that pattern? It's kind of hard to see on this screen, but you can actually see that line. That's because Revit's just taking that image and it's just tiling it all over the wall. So when you use a seamless pattern, it creates it so that it actually looks real. It looks correct. Okay? All right, let's stop there. I could definitely keep going. We'll go to lunch here in about 5 minutes, but we can start to kind of get organized for the lab. That should be all of the material that you need to start working on the second part of the residence, okay? So you should be able to start going down here and start to finish each of these steps of this project. I will likely think of something else to tell you during the lab, just because I'll think of some cool tricks and tools that will help you, but I don't always think of them at the exact same time. So that'll be everything that you need to complete the second part of the residence project, and I'll likely tell you a couple more things later on, okay? Any questions? Questions at all, okay? I can already see something that I know I'm going to go back and tell you, but I'll go back and we'll talk about it after lunch. All right, so that's it. Let's go to, we can go to lunch here in just a couple minutes. You can go now if you're ready to go, but let's come back from lunch at 12:45. Okay, so it's about 45 minutes, and then we'll start working on our project.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course.